Welcome to Emancipate Humanity with Bob Avakian, a podcast presented by the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show. My name is Annie Day, one of your hosts for this podcast series featuring the voice and work of Bob Avakian, B.A. B.A. is a revolutionary. He came out of the free speech movement in Berkeley in the 1960s, then worked with the early Black Panther Party, and then went on to become a revolutionary communist. Over the decades since, he has worked to develop a whole new framework of human emancipation, the new communism. Some of what you'll hear in this series of podcasts will be short, biting commentary. Others, deep exploration and answers to burning questions. You'll be provoked, challenged, and struggled with to think and to rethink, to shed illusions. You'll laugh and be moved by B.A.'s passion for the people and his refusal to accept all the unnecessary suffering here and all over the world. All of this has one aim and one aim only, to enable all of us to be part of a great struggle for an actual revolution to emancipate all humanity. This is our invitation to you, to experience Bob Avakian. Today's episode of Emancipate Humanity with Bob Avakian features 4 pieces published on the website revcom.us. Today's theme is captured in the featured piece of this episode: Conspiracy Theories, Fascist Certitude, Liberal Paralysis, or a Scientific Approach to Changing the World. These pieces speak to the crimes of Trump-Pence fascism, dig into the underlying system that's given rise to this, why the Democrats are no answer, and most of all, how to understand reality in the struggle to change it fundamentally. We're going to start with a shorter piece, Bob Avakian, on ugly words and phrases, then go into our featured piece. Next, you'll hear Kayleigh McEnany, Living Dead Liar for Trump, and we'll end with It's Not the Democrats, It's the Whole System, an answer to Candace Owens and other Black Nazi demagogues. So let's get right to Bob Avakian.
On ugly words and phrases. Here are words and phrases that should never be used in the wrong way by anyone who hungers for a more just world. Officers, to refer to police, and the president, to refer to Trump. Police should not be referred to as officers, but murdering racist pigs, for that is what they are. Trump should not be referred to as the president, but the racist, pig-loving fascist in the White House, for that is what he is. Next time you're watching mainstream television, every time you hear them refer to cops as officers and refer to Trump as the president, make a sound like beep. Check out how many times you end up making that sound. These mainstream media use these terms this way, officer and the president, to show respect and lend legitimacy to what should never be respected and made legitimate: brutal oppressors and institutions of oppression. Why do these media do this? Because they are also an arm of the same oppressive system, the system of capitalism, imperialism, that the president and the officers maintain and enforce. And as much as people in these mainstream media may dislike Trump, he is still the president of their system. And the police are the agents of the repressive and murderous law and order of this same system.
That was Bob Avakian on ugly words and phrases. And next up is Conspiracy Theories, Fascist Certitude, Liberal Paralysis, or a Scientific Approach to Changing the World. The longer version, the Truth Elaborated.
Conspiracy Theories, Fascist Certitude, Liberal Paralysis, or a Scientific Approach to Changing the World. Longer version, the Truth Elaborated. The coronavirus crisis has brought home very sharply the importance of science, the scientific method and approach to understanding and changing the world. But there is a big problem in how people have been trained and conditioned to think, or not think. Even as people in the medical field are proceeding on the basis of a scientific approach, and in the context of this coronavirus crisis, liberals are insisting that it is vitally important now to listen to the scientists. For far too long, many liberals and progressives have allowed themselves to become paralyzed by relativist agnosticism, lacking and often even rejecting the very idea of certitude, with ridiculous notions like, how can you know what is really true? No one can say that their truth is greater than someone else's truth, and so on. Meanwhile, fascist forces, marked by a truly dark ages mentality and firmly convinced of the truth of all manner of lunatic conspiracy theories promoting fascist values and objectives, are eagerly embracing callous Philistinism, willfully rejecting critical thinking, smugly ignoring, defying, and denigrating science and the scientific method. Put another way, in terms of major trends in society as a whole, those who have the most certitude are those most out of touch with reality. Further complicating the situation, and an additional dimension to this problem, is the fact that although they do not share but strongly oppose the values and objectives of the fascists, many of the basic masses who are bitterly oppressed under this system also are suspicious of and even are inclined to reject science and scientifically grounded analysis. But this also leaves you vulnerable to all kinds of unfounded conspiracy theories and other wrong and harmful ideas, including the notion that nothing people do will make a difference because it's all in God's hands. The answer to all this is not giving up on understanding reality or simply believing what sounds like it makes sense or what is said by someone you know or what gives you comfort, at least for a while. The truth of something does not depend on who says it or how it makes you feel. Because something comes from a source you like does not make it true. And because something comes from a source you do not like does not make it untrue. And truth is not a popularity contest. Because a lot of people believe something does not make it true. And because only a few people believe something does not make it untrue. Truth is objective, which means whether something is true or not depends on whether it corresponds to actual reality. On some levels, the truth of things is obvious. For example, the truth that if it is raining hard and you are exposed to the rain for any length of time, you will get wet. But there are deeper levels to things, and the truth about them is more complex and requires more developed knowledge. For example, what causes rain? Why is it raining where you are and not somewhere else? And so on. But in all cases, on all levels, the fact remains. Whether something is true or not depends on whether it corresponds to actual reality. To sort out what is false from what is true, and to stand on solid ground in terms of understanding things, you need the scientific method and approach to reality. And yes, scientifically grounded certitude, where such certitude can and must be established. Science is not another dogma, another untested and unproved set of beliefs. It is the opposite of that. Conclusions based on the application of the scientific method are obviously important, but science is not just some collection of conclusions, and still less is it a set of precepts which are not drawn from reality and are out of keeping with reality, or which once reflected reality but have become frozen and ossified and no longer correspond to a changing reality. Science is above all and most essentially a method. In this regard, the following from an interview with Ardea Skybreak, a professionally trained scientist and an advocate of the new communism as a further advance in the science of revolution, is very relevant. So I think it might be worth starting a little bit by talking about what is science, to demystify it a little bit. I mean, science deals with material reality, and you could say that all of nature and all of human society is the province of science. Science can deal with all of that. It's a tool, science, a very powerful tool. It's a method and approach for being able to tell what's true, what corresponds to reality as it really is. In that sense, science is very different than religion or mysticism or things like that, which try to explain reality by invoking imaginary forces and which provide no actual evidence for any of their analyses. By contrast, science requires proof. It requires evidence. It is an evidence-based process. That's very important. Science is an evidence-based process. If you don't judge things by whether there is compelling evidence for them, and if you don't evaluate what people claim by weighing it against what the evidence shows about the actual reality, you can end up believing almost anything. Or as Skybreak puts it, without science, you are at the mercy of being manipulated, of having your thinking manipulated, and not being able to tell what's right from what's wrong, what's true from what's false. And whether you're talking about the material reality of a disease, of a natural ecosystem, or of a social system that human beings live under, science allows you to analyze its components, its history, how it came to be the way it is, what it's made of, what are its defining characteristics and underlying contradictoriness, and we'll come back to that, and therefore also what is the basis for it to change or to be changed if your intent is to change it. Whether you want to cure a disease or make a better society, you need that scientific, evidence-based process. Skybreak emphasizes the point that science is not mysterious, but is something that anyone can learn and apply. She also speaks to the contradiction that sometimes people are turned off to science, partly because they have been given the wrong sense of what science is. And another reason people are sometimes turned off by science is because there has been bad science. Sometimes in the course of history, science has been used to promote the idea that some races are inferior to other races. Well, that's junk science. In fact, you can use rigorous scientific methods to prove that that was all bad science. It's not just morally bad, it is that, but it's also scientifically bad. It's completely false, and you can use good science to prove that. As I have put it, in line with the essential point made by Skybreak, it is the good science, the scientific method and approach of proceeding from the evidence about reality to understand how reality actually is, why it is the way it is, and how it is changing and could be changed further, that we need to consistently apply if we want to transform the world to uproot oppression and exploitation. Consistently applying a scientific method, following the truth wherever it leads. Far too often, and with no small amount of irony, educated middle-class liberals, progressives, and the woke act as if they are asserting some profound truth when they reject the very notion of truth and decry and denounce as dogmatic or even tyrannical those who say that they have arrived at certain definite truths. But once again, opposing the scientific method and approach and denying the possibility of arriving at important truths by applying this method and approach can only lead to bad, sometimes extremely bad results, leaving people weighed down by all kinds of ignorance and prejudice, depriving people of the ability to understand and change the world in a fundamentally positive direction. And is this approach of denying the possibility or desirability of knowing the truth and denouncing those who say they have brought forward definite, important truths, is this really valid and viable? Something people can or should stick with? When, for example, Jonas Salk announced that he had finally developed a vaccine to deal with the terrible disease polio, should the response actually have been to be suspicious of this claim and reject it without even looking into it, and to criticize or even ostracize Salk for having the nerve to claim that he had arrived at an important truth, an understanding of the disease polio and how to combat it? Should people actually respond in that way if or when a vaccine is developed for COVID-19? Examples of this kind could be cited almost endlessly. As I have emphasized, speaking to what is a fundamental epistemological principle of the new communism, the truth is an actual correct reflection of reality, including in its motion and development. And of course, it is true that nobody can ever have all of the truth. That's part of understanding reality correctly, part of the scientific method. But it is true that you can come to definite and definitive determinations about the reality of many particular things, even while you always have to be open to learning more, and to the possibility that some of what you thought to be true may not turn out to be true, or new developments occur which mean that the world has changed in such a way that your understanding has to be modified. That's all part of the scientific method as well. When we talk about the truth, we're not talking about the truth as an absolute and final truth, but we are also not talking about a narrative. We're talking about a scientific approach to understanding reality and then on that basis transforming it. And the scientific approach to that process of analyzing and synthesizing reality can come to important definitive conclusions, even as this is an ongoing process which is never complete because you can never grasp all of reality, including because it's constantly changing and because there will always be aspects of reality that human beings will not even have penetrated at any given time, let alone come to understand. There is a definite connection between the relativism and agnosticism of far too many educated middle-class liberals and their reluctance, if not stubborn refusal, to recognize the fascist danger posed by the Trump-Pence regime for what it is and what is required in the face of this, which is a determined struggle against this fascism, a struggle that does not rely or depend upon the mainstream section of the ruling class, as represented by institutions like the Democratic Party and the system they serve, which has given rise to this fascism, out of whose basic contradictions this fascism has arisen as an attempt at a resolution of these contradictions within the confines of this system and in the most extreme terms. Even more fundamentally, there is a definite connection between the relativism and agnosticism of such liberals and their resistance or stubborn refusal to apply a consistently scientific, evidence-based approach, and on this basis to follow the truth wherever it leads, particularly when it comes to historical, social, and political questions, because where it leads is to demolishing cherished delusions and prejudices of liberals regarding the actual role of this great American democracy throughout its history and throughout the world, the actual nature of the system we live under, capitalism, imperialism, and the actual experience of revolutionary struggle against this system, and more particularly, the experience of the communist movement and the socialist societies it has brought into being. It is in deeply engaging these questions and drawing from many different dimensions of human experience that I have brought forward a new communism, which is a continuation of, but also represents a qualitative leap beyond, and in some important ways a break with, communist theory as it had been previously developed, and which has put communism on an even more consistently scientific basis, providing the strategy and leadership for an actual revolution and a radically new society on the road to real emancipation. In regard to all this, it is worth repeating the very important point emphasized by Ardea Skybreak. Whether you want to cure a disease or make a better society, you need that scientific, evidence-based process. And specifically in terms of making a better society, in opposing the fascism of the Trump-Pence regime, and even more fundamentally, in making a radical leap beyond this capitalist imperialist system, which has given rise to this fascism, and bringing into being a far better world, you need the scientific method and approach of the new communism.
That was Conspiracy Theories, Fascist Certitude, Liberal Paralysis, or a Scientific Approach to Changing the World. Next, we'll hear Kayleigh McEnany, Living Dead Liar for Trump.
Kayleigh McEnany, Living Dead Liar for Trump. The mainstream media of this system, CNN, MSNBC, etc., often talk about how Kayleigh McEnany lies in her capacity as press secretary for the Trump White House. No one should be surprised by this. If you're going to represent the liar-in-chief, you have to constantly, systematically lie. But while CNN and company make a point of repeatedly insisting that facts are important. Here is a fact that these mainstream media will not tell you. Kayleigh McEnany is a religious fundamentalist fanatic, part of the living dead legions of this regime. So she is completely out of touch with reality anyway. Ask yourself why that fact is something you will not hear from these mainstream media.
That was Kayleigh McEnany, living dead liar for Trump. And we'll close out this episode with, "It's not the Democrats, it's the whole system," an answer to Candace Owens and other Black Nazi demagogues.
It's not the Democrats, it's the whole system. An answer to Candace Owens and other Black Nazi demagogues. Candace Owens and other Black conservatives who support the white supremacist fascist Donald Trump try to justify their contemptible actions by claiming that it is the Democratic Party that is responsible for keeping Black people in a subordinated position. As I have spoken to and concretely illustrated many times, the Democratic Party does play an important part in the subjugation and degradation of Black people, including the way in which masses of Black people, and in particular youth, are robbed of a decent future, cordoned and contained in ghettos of deprivation and desperation, murdered by marauding police, and driven and encouraged to kill each other. But the Democratic Party does this as an instrument, one of the key institutions of the system of capitalism imperialism that is the source of this oppression. A system resting on the cruel exploitation and murderous oppression of not only Black people, but masses of other people as well, not just in this country, but throughout the world. And the Republican Party is certainly no less an instrument of this monstrous system, especially as that party has, over recent decades, become an even more overtly white supremacist, male supremacist, anti-immigrant, xenophobic, and bellicose American chauvinist. Particularly after World War II, with major changes going on in this country and the world as a whole, out of one side of its mouth, the Democratic Party portrayed itself as the friend and savior of Black people. But the Democratic Party had a deep and increasingly sharp contradiction within it. Its northern wing presented itself as liberal, while its southern wing, known as Dixiecrats, was openly, vehemently, and violently white supremacist. This came to a head in the 1960s, when the leaders of the Democratic Party found themselves in a position where they had to make concessions to the struggle for civil rights. The Dixiecrats deserted the Democratic Party and became a key force within the Republican Party. Since that time, the Republicans have become more and more openly the party of white supremacy. Malcolm X spoke very plainly to this situation. He said, "One of these parties, the Democrats, says they're for you, while the other one, the Republicans, says they're against you. One of them is a fox, and the other one is a wolf. But they are both part of the canine family. They are both racist dogs." It is tempting to see it as simply an act of incredible stupidity to join with the ones who are openly against you. But on the part of Candace Owens and some other Black conservatives, their support for Trump and the Republicans is not so much a matter of stupidity as it is a striving to get in on the loot, the spoils that come from the plundering of the world by U.S. capitalist imperialism, and their belief that the best means for them to get the largest possible share of the spoils is playing the servile role of Black people justifying and even advocating white supremacy, but doing so while loudly and crudely declaring that any who oppose what they are doing are racists who want to keep Black people in their place. That they do this in the name of Black people's advancement is all the more disgusting and despicable. There is nothing new or original in this. We have seen it in the ridiculous posturing and the overall performance of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. And going back to the days of Jim Crow segregation and Ku Klux Klan terror, there was Booker T. Washington, a Black leader who preached to Black people that instead of rising up against their segregated and terrorized situation, they should strive to do their best while remaining within those terrible conditions. No wonder Washington was one of the most favored speakers at rallies of white supremacist Southern segregationists. And no wonder that the likes of Candace Owens are such darlings of the overt white supremacist fascists of today. The answer to this is not to rally behind the Democratic Party, which has played such a crucial part in keeping Black people oppressed and terrorized, while pretending to be their best hope, and which has been such a key instrument of this whole system, with its unspeakable crimes against the masses of humanity. The answer is to oppose the whole monstrous system of capitalism imperialism, which both the Democrats and the Republicans serve and work to maintain. To rise up against this system and build that struggle toward the goal of revolution to abolish this whole system and bring a much better system into being. The strategy for actually making this revolution has been brought forward through the ongoing work I have done over decades, since the 1960s, and a sweeping vision and concrete blueprint for a radically different and far better society and world is contained in the Constitution for the new Socialist Republic in North America, all of which can be found at revcom.us. Let the Candace Owenses of the world shuffle, scuffle, and scratch for a share of the blood-soaked spoils of this system. For all those who hunger for a world without all the atrocity and terror, all the unnecessary suffering that is caused by this system of capitalism imperialism, let us rise together to put an end to all this in the only way it can be done. Revolution, nothing less. A revolution not for revenge or to get ours through the exploitation and degradation of others. A revolution for the emancipation of all humanity.
Go to the website revcom.us to find out more about Bob Avakian, where you can also find the written text of all 4 pieces we heard today. At revcom.us, you can access the full body of Bob Avakian's work, his essays, sharp, timely articles, the Constitution for a New Socialist Republic in North America that he authored, along with books, films, and audio. You can also find the full body of his work at the website thebobavakianinstitute.org. We encourage you to watch our weekly YouTube show, the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show, which can be found on youtube.com/therevcoms, which also hosts this podcast, Emancipate Humanity with Bob Avakian. Find us on social media at the Revcoms and become a subscriber to this channel for updates.